And in this lesson, we're going to go over basic learning theory, how our horses learn, how we can be effective in training. There's a lot of theory here. Some of it's a little bit dense, and we'll make sure that all of this makes sense to you guys before we move ahead to more practical application and exercises. Learning theory is really a vast area that I'm going to do a bit of a disservice to right now by simplifying it in such a way, but I think this is the most simple way to talk about how horses learn in training, and get you guys get your wheels spinning about the psychology of learning and how we can be most effective teachers, and helping our learners be as successful as possible. So the two ways we're going to talk about are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. With classical conditioning, we're thinking about Pavlov's dogs. I think most of us learned about that at some point during your high school education. But with this, we're pairing what was once a neutral stimulus with no real meaning to the learner with an unconditioned stimulus, so something that automatically provokes a response without having been trained. And you're going to do that repeatedly so that eventually this neutral stimulus elicits the same response as the unconditioned stimulus. So this is an involuntary response to a stimulus. With Pavlov's dog experiment, he would ring a bell and then present the dogs with food, and he would do that over and over and over until eventually the dog started salivating just at the sound of the bell without waiting for the food to be presented. So that's classical conditioning. The other thing we have in our toolbox is operant conditioning. It's a little bit more robust of a tool. This is a method where you're pairing rewards or punishments with a behavior in order to modify that behavior. So instead of classical conditioning, where it's an involuntary response to a stimulus, operant conditioning is more pairing voluntary behaviors with consequences. So if we see a behavior that we really like, we can reward it, and that should make the behavior happen more often. Whereas if there's a behavior that we would like to see happen less often, pairing it with a punisher should make it happen less often. We'll slide over here into the quadrants of operant conditioning, because within that framework of rewards and punishers, we have four main ways to use those things to alter behavior. So if you look at my chart here, upper left-hand corner, I've got a heart, and that is my stand-in for something that the learner likes. Over to the right upper corner, got the circle with the line through it. That's my symbol for something that the learner finds aversive, something that the learner does not like. We look on the left-hand vertical column, we've got a plus sign. That's our positive sign, and in this case, when we're talking positive, we're thinking mathematically, so the addition of something. We look down underneath, we've got the subtraction symbol. Again, we're saying negative, it's not meaning bad. Negative just means we're taking something away. So we'll start in the upper left-hand corner, and we're talking about positive reinforcement. So this is adding something that the learner likes to increase the occurrence of a behavior. An example of this might be, I really like it when my horse stands calmly in the cross ties. So when I notice he is standing calm and relaxed, I will give him a treat. And hopefully that over time will create a horse who is going to stand calmly in the cross ties more often. We'll slide down to negative punishment, because positive reinforcement and negative punishment kind of go hand in hand. Negative punishment is going to be removing something that the horse likes in order to decrease the occurrence of a behavior. So the most clear example I can think of with this is if you have two kids and they're fighting over a toy and you want them to stop fighting, you take the toy away, and that's their punishment to make them stop fighting. Now, in the horse training world, if we're working with positive reinforcement, sometimes we can run into accidentally negatively punishing a horse because they want to engage in the training. They're trying to do, behaviors to get the food reward. And if we're withholding food, or if we end the training session early, that can be perceived as punishing in some instances by some horses. So we just need to be aware of that as a potential that we want to kind of try to mitigate. So let's slide over to the right-hand side, and I'm actually going to go to that bottom right-hand corner first and talk about negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is what your traditional pressure and release training is based off of. It's probably the most common thing we see in the horse training world. It's very widespread. Negative reinforcement is going to be removing something that the learner finds aversive in order to increase the occurrence of that behavior. So negative reinforcement example might be when you're riding your horse, you're asking him to walk on, and you're going to apply a leg aid by kind of pressing your leg into the horse's side to ask him to walk on. You're going to apply the leg aid first, so that's your aversive stimulus. When the horse walks on, you're removing that leg aid, and that's the reinforcement aspect to let the horse know that was the correct response. So I think we can all relate to that in some form or fashion. Then we move up to positive punishment. This is adding something aversive to decrease the occurrence of the behavior. So let's say your horse bites you and you smack him in the face. So I see that all the time. Smacking the horse in the face is meant to be punishing to stop the horse from biting you. Whether or not that works, we will talk a little bit more about later, but that is the theory behind positive punishment. So just like I talked about positive reinforcement and negative punishment going hand in hand, we need to be aware that negative reinforcement and positive punishment can also go hand in hand. So we talked about, with our negative reinforcement example, applying a leg aid to ask the horse to walk on and removing the leg aid when he does. But the question is, what happens when the horse ignores your leg aid and does not walk on? He just stands still. So we have a few options. Some people will start to kick the horse. You might add a crop or a whip and start to tap harder and harder and harder until the horse walks on. So there's a scale there between aversive and aversive enough that it becomes punishing, right? And that's going to be a different scale for every horse. So we just need to be aware, if we're working with negative reinforcement and we're escalating our aversives, that we don't escalate to the point where we're now working in a positive punishment kind of a scenario here on accident. And I say on accident because I am a pretty strong believer that punishment should never be used intentionally as a training tool, especially with horses, but truly with anything, with your kids, with your dogs. Punishment is just not something we should be using intentionally. Sometimes it's unavoidable, it's accidental. We just need to be aware and try to decrease that as much as possible. But we don't want to use it intentionally because it's ineffective, and frankly, I think it's unethical. So in order for positive punishment to suppress behavior, it has to be severe enough that it makes the learner never want to repeat that. And sometimes that has to be pretty darn severe. And that's why I say the ethics are super questionable when we're talking about using punishment. It also has to be timed pretty darn perfectly so that the animal actually associates the punisher with the behavior you're trying to punish. If you're a couple milliseconds too late, that horse has already forgotten what he did that you're mad about, and he might now associate that punisher with the next thing he starts to do, which is probably not at all what you were trying to punish in the first place. So in that way, it's totally ineffective. I'm going to have on our recommended reading list some more resources, some scientific studies, things to back up what I'm saying about punishment, why it's not an effective teaching tool. If any of you guys have questions on that, But just know in this course, punishment is not something we're going to use intentionally, and we're going to try to be very aware of situations where we might be using negative punishment, particularly when we don't mean to. All right, so before we wrap this up, I just want to make a little note about bribes, because I have a feeling there are some of you out there who are having this thought. Positive reinforcement training is not the same as a bribe. So with positive reinforcement training, we are pairing the behavior which comes first with a positive consequence, in this case, food. With a bribe, the reinforcing stimulus comes first. So the food is presented first in order to elicit the desired behavior. So the order of things is flip-flopped. With positive reinforcement, when the horse approaches me, I give him a reward. With a bribe, we walk out into the pasture with our bucket full of food and we rattle the food to get the horse to come over to us. So that's the difference. Bribes, sometimes you do what you got to do and a bribe is used. But bribes are not something that I use intentionally as a training tool, because they just really are not effective. When you're training with bribes, the bribe has to be present to elicit the behavior. And our goal is to make the horse love the behavior. So he wants to offer it, just because he has this subconscious love for the behavior that maybe he doesn't even know why he loves it, but he's going to do it. And the food reward is what gets us to that point. So hopefully that makes sense. We are not training with bribes. We are training with strategic positive reinforcement training. If you guys have any questions about this, I know it's pretty theory dense, but I want you guys to have a solid understanding of all of this before we start going into the training, because it's going to help you prevent some common pitfalls that leads people to have trouble with some of this kind of stuff. So if any of this is clear as mud to you, my contact information is in that welcome series at the beginning of the course. So shoot me an email. We'll make sure you guys have a solid understanding of what's going on. If you're ready to move on, I'll see you in the next lesson.